Officially, there was peace. The fight for survival in the trenches was over. But the fight for improved wages and working conditions at home raged more ferociously than ever. Across Canada, strike followed strike, while up and down the West Coast, labor and management clashed in factories, mines, and lumber camps. Capitalist and Bolshevik were the battle cries of opposing forces. Workers rioted and marched on the legislature. The one big union concept gathered momentum, and when in 1919 the Winnipeg General Strike paralyzed that city, workers in Vancouver walked off their jobs in sympathy. But if British Columbians were divided on many important issues, they unanimously supported at least one. Their province would not follow the example of the United States and ban the sale of alcoholic beverages. All the other provinces, with the exception of Quebec, were engaged in prohibition in one form or another. Not so on the coast, where an annual profit of $3 million was realized from the sale of liquor. The 20s roared in, and rum runners roared out from Victoria and Vancouver to wait off Puget Sound with cargoes of whiskey for bootlegging gangsters from below the border. And now there was the roaring of the automobile, a machine for the family, a machine that could travel anywhere, if there were roads. By 1925, motorists could drive from Vancouver to Revelstoke. The more daring car owners risked the dusty, rutted road that led north off the Trans-Canada Highway to the Caribou. Of course, there were the more traditional modes of travel. In 1921, 6 people casually left Halifax on foot. 5 of them reached Vancouver 6 months later. They'd walked 3,600 miles. On July 1st, 1927, Canada celebrated the Diamond Jubilee of Confederation. A highlight of that celebration was the first coast-to-coast radio broadcast. The voice of a province once isolated by geography could be heard across a continent. The last occasion in that decade for province-wide rejoicing took place in 1928. That was the year a young man from Vancouver, Percy Williams, beat the best in the world to win the Olympic 100 and 200-meter sprints. As the 1920s drew to a close, the nation enjoyed an unprecedented prosperity, particularly in British Columbia, where the per capita income was $600, $100 higher than in any other Canadian province. The Canadian Pacific Railway Company began enlarging the Empress Hotel in Victoria. The Canadian National started work on the Hotel Vancouver. Then came the stock market crash of 1929. Work on the CN Hotel stopped, and the huge excavation on Georgia Street remained vacant throughout the Depression years, a gaping reminder of empty dreams and pocketbooks. In the years that followed, the unemployed tramped into British Columbia. Lines of soup kitchens and relief offices grew longer and longer. The price of beef fell to 10 cents a pound. Hamburgers sold for 3 pounds for a quarter. Few could afford it. Radicals played upon the misery and despair of the people. The leader of the Communist Party, Tim Buck, was hailed as a martyr and a hero when released from prison on parole in November of 1934. Citizens of Victoria jammed the Chamber of Commerce auditorium to hear him speak. The federal government established relief camps where the unemployed were given food and clothing. In return, the men cleared land, cut wood, or worked on road gangs for a payment of 10 to 20 cents a day. The camps were under Army administration, and this fact added fuel to the flames of discontent ignited by professional agitators and malcontents. There were serious disturbances in British Columbia camps in 1933 and 34. A year later, 1,000 strikers from Vancouver began their march on Ottawa, led by an avowed communist, Arthur Evans. The march was to end in riot and bloodshed in Regina. But there were other men who maintained a measure of dignity and self-respect by striking out on their own. They headed into the Caribou country, and by working old claims salvaged enough gold to survive. A people caught up in the suffering of a depression showed little concern when a 1934 government census estimated that the original Indian population of the province had shrunk from 80,000 to 23,600. These were the helpless years, when men and women could do little but listen to their radios and pray for conditions to improve. And just when it seemed their prayers had been answered, war was declared. With dramatic sharpness, the do-nothing days of the Depression were followed by the frantic activity of war. For British Columbia, it was a war made very real by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Only an ocean separated the province from an enemy whose awesome sea and air power had shattered the American fleet. Acting in near panic, the coast was declared a protected area. All residents of Japanese origin were removed to relocation centers on the prairies. Many would never return to their homes, but would instead resettle in Ontario. Others would return to find their property confiscated. The Canadian force that had sailed from Vancouver for Hong Kong in November of 1941 had already fallen to the enemy. Now Japan was threatening Midway Island and the Aleutians. The 8th Division was rushed to northern British Columbia. The 6th was assigned to the defense of Vancouver Island. By the summer of 1943, there were more than 34,000 soldiers in Pacific Command, together with units of the Canadian and American fleets. The Allies invaded Kiska that August, but the Japanese had already evacuated the island. Nevertheless, the coastal province had reason to fear the enemy. On June 20th, 1942, a naval vessel was torpedoed and sunk 70 miles off Cape Flattery. The next night, a Japanese submarine surfaced and shelled the lighthouse and radio station at Estevan Point on Vancouver Island. Later, Japanese bombs carried by balloon across the Pacific exploded harmlessly in the forests. British Columbia was the only Canadian territory to come under direct enemy attack during the war. By the time Japan had surrendered in 1945, the province had again paid its price for victory. But by doing so, it had developed a new maturity. The citizens of British Columbia emerged from the conflict with a sense of purpose, almost a sense of destiny, as though the visions that had inspired Vancouver and Mackenzie and Fraser and Thompson had been rekindled. Until the post-war period, nature had seemed to merely tolerate man's presence there. Centuries of endeavor appeared insignificant against the spectacle of mountains, rivers, forests, and canyons. Less than 1 million people inhabited more than 366,000 square miles of territory. But with the technology of an atomic age, the land was transformed. Dams were constructed across mighty rivers to provide electric power for industry and to irrigate parched valleys. Modern highways tamed the Rogers Pass and the Caribou Trail. Aircraft leapt mountains with passengers and mail, and the way was opened for Canadians everywhere to explore the West beyond the West. They came to British Columbia by the thousands, and the population was doubled. The resources of the land were as spectacular and varied as its scenery. Natural gas reserves were estimated at 7 trillion cubic feet. There were endless supplies of base metals, and Trail could boast the largest smelters of silver, lead, and zinc in the world. At Kitimat, 200,000 tons of aluminum were produced each year. 300 miles to the northwest, ranches, some of them larger than the province of Prince Edward Island, exported 43,000 head of prime beef to the United States alone. And south of the range country, in the Okanagan Valley, over 3,400 orchards produced 10 different varieties of apples, as well as peaches, pears, plums, cherries, and grapes. No superlatives could describe the industrial potential of a province so richly forested that it exported 2.5 billion board feet of lumber per year, while unharvested timber decayed at an annual rate of 600 million board feet. The tourists came to marvel at this strange country, governed now by Premier W.A.C. Bennett and his Social Credit Party. This country where the cosmopolitan center of Vancouver, Canada's third largest city, with its Chinatown, nightclubs, symphony orchestra, opera company, and theatrical groups, casually went about its business in sight of mountains supposedly inhabited by the Sasquatch, that hairy figure of Indian legend. They came to listen to stories about monstrous serpents in Lake Okanagan and Cadbro Bay, and they left with the conviction that in British Columbia, anything is possible. And there were the others, the sports fans who came to see Roger Bannister win the Mile of the Century, or to sit in Empire Stadium and watch the Grey Cup game with the largest crowd in Canadian football history, or to pay tribute to a girl from Rossland named Nancy Green. who in 1967 became the world's champion woman skier. The sportsmen came to fish and hunt, to race their yachts and to swim. For Canadians everywhere, a journey to the coast marked a moment of rediscovery when they could stand between the cloud-piercing towers of the Rockies and the roaring surf of the Pacific, and there, at the edge of the sea, listen to those voices of the past that intermingle with the crash of waves along that ancient shore. The voices of the Haida and the Nootka. Vancouver's voice, describing this new world as the most lovely country that can be imagined. The voice of Sir John A. Macdonald when he said, "Here I could spend the rest of my days content." And then Lord Dufferin's voice when he declared, "I think British Columbia a glorious province, a province which Canada should be proud to possess, and whose association with the Dominion she ought to regard as the crowning triumph of federation." There, on the rim of the Pacific, surrounded by the prosperity of the present, Canadians could reaffirm their pride in the past. On that shore that marks the boundary of a province and the beginning of a nation. British Columbia, 1971. A time to remember.